General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, the man the myth was built around. 12,500 men are walking into an open field. No cover, no flanking route, no artillery support that actually worked. Just men, boots on dry Pennsylvania grass, walking forward across 3/4 of a mile toward rifles they can already see. The general who ordered this watched from a distance. He called himself a genius. The field disagreed. That charge killed or wounded more than half the men who made it, 51% casualties, under 1 hour. And here's what nobody tells you. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't fog of war. It was the logical, inevitable endpoint of a pattern that had been building for 2 full years. A pattern written not in battle reports, but in arithmetic. Robert E. Lee is the most mythologized military commander in American history. Tactician of genius, the man who outthought superior forces again and again. The greatest soldier the continent produced. That's the story. Here's the math. By the summer of 1863, Lee had bled his army at a proportional rate greater than any comparable force in American military history. He won battles, brilliant battles, battles that still get taught at West Point. And he was losing the war with every single one of them. We'll come back to that number, because what it reveals changes everything about how this story gets told. 2 questions anchor everything that follows. First, did Robert E. Lee have a coherent military strategy, or was he a tactical performer who never understood the larger game? Second, and this one cuts deeper, why did the myth survive when the math so clearly didn't? If you want the stories they cut from the history books, subscribe. Every week, one war, one truth. Stay with this, because what happens next is the part they don't teach. Robert E. Lee, Arlington House, Virginia, April 18, 1861. He's in the parlor with a letter from Winfield Scott. The offer is real. Command of the Union Army, the largest military force this continent has ever assembled. Scott, his mentor, his professional father, the man who shaped his career, has put Lee's name forward personally. Lee is 54, 30 years in the United States Army, graduated second in his West Point class. His entire professional identity lives inside that institution. He turns the offer down in 48 hours. Not because he's certain. His letter to Scott uses careful, anguished language. He cannot raise his hand against Virginia, against his relatives, his children, his home. Virginia seceded the day before. The decision has already been made by the state, and Lee knows that staying Union means spending the war killing men he's known his entire adult life. What he doesn't write down, he also knows the Confederacy needs him more than the Union does. The Union has Scott. The Confederacy has almost nobody with his experience. He makes his choice. He will spend the rest of his life explaining it. John Dooley, Richmond, Virginia, summer 1861. John Dooley is 18 years old, and he believes this is going to be glorious. Catholic family. Georgetown educated. His father is a prosperous Irish-born merchant who made something of himself in the New World, and John has inherited the confidence of a young man who has never been truly hungry, never been truly afraid. He volunteers for the 1st Virginia Infantry with the enthusiasm of someone who has read too much Walter Scott, and not nearly enough about what a Minié ball does to a femur at close range. His diary from this period reads like a boy at the edge of the greatest adventure of his life. The parades through Richmond, women throwing flowers from second-floor windows. The feeling, intoxicating, specific, unrepeatable, that history is happening and he is inside it. He writes about the cause with the sincerity of someone who has never watched a friend die. He hasn't. Not yet. By the time John Dooley truly understands what he signed up for, it will be far too late to sign out. Colonel Fremantle, Texas to Virginia, spring 1863. Arthur James Lyon. Fremantle arrives in America in April 1863 with the professional detachment of a man who has been sent to watch a war. Lieutenant Colonel, Coldstream Guards. He keeps a meticulous diary. He's seen combat in other theaters, and he knows what competent generalship looks like from the outside. He moves through the Confederacy like an anthropologist, recording the food, the roads, the discipline of troops, the precise way officers carry themselves. He's charmed by the Southern officer class in the way British officers often are, men who remind them of an aristocratic structure they understand and respect. He reaches Lee's army in late June 1863. He'll be in time for everything. What Fremantle writes over the next 4 days becomes one of the most cited primary sources of the entire Civil War. People quote him when they want to show Lee's composure under pressure. They almost never quote what he writes about the decisions that made the pressure necessary. Nobody in those last days of June 1863 knew what Pennsylvania was going to cost them. Antietam, September 17, 1862, the sunken road. Before Gettysburg, there was Antietam. And before we talk about what Lee decided, you need to hear what it looked like from inside. Sergeant Major Thomas Livermore is 19 years old. He's with the Union forces pushing toward a farm lane worn down by decades of wagon wheels into a shallow trench, what soldiers will call the sunken road. Behind that road, Confederate infantry from D.H. Hill's division has turned the lane into a natural fortification. Livermore writes in his memoir, Days and Events, that the cornfield north of the road doesn't look like a cornfield anymore. It looks like a floor. Men from both sides, cut down in the rows, lying where they fell between the stalks. His regiment crosses that cornfield at a walk, because running would break the formation, and breaking the formation means dying faster. He writes that he stopped counting the dead after the first 100 yards. By the end of September 17, 1862, one single day, the combined armies suffer approximately 22,700 casualties, killed, wounded, missing. 22,700 men, every person living today in a city the size of Flagstaff, Arizona, gone in 12 hours. Lee's army suffers roughly 10,300 of those. The Union suffers approximately 12,400. Lee holds the field. He does not retreat until the following night. By the narrowest military definition, Antietam is a draw. By every strategic definition, it's a Confederate catastrophe. And here's why. Before we get to the battle, there's something you need to understand. The deadweight of math. This war was never just fought with rifles. It was fought with arithmetic. The Union had 22 million people. The Confederacy had 9 million, and roughly 3.5 million of those were enslaved men and women the Confederate government refused to arm until it was almost too late. Effective Confederate military manpower, somewhere around 850,000 to 1 million men across the entire war. Union military manpower, over 2 million served. Every Confederate soldier who fell at Antietam left a gap that couldn't be filled. There was no replacement depot deep enough. No immigration pipeline, feeding new men into Southern regiments the way Irish and German immigrants were filling Union ranks in New York and Boston and Cincinnati. Lee was fighting a war against a calculator, and the calculator was winning. When Lee crossed into Maryland in September 1862, he had approximately 55,000 men. He'd already been fighting for 3 months. His army was hungry, barefoot in places, exhausted. He was invading Union territory with a force that couldn't be fully resupplied even if he won. Longstreet told him not to cross the Potomac. Lee crossed anyway. Richmond was saved from McClellan's Peninsula campaign. That was real. That mattered. But the butcher's bill was just beginning. Lee had won the battle, but he was bleeding his nation to death one brilliant engagement at a time. And his next move? It would be the biggest strategic gamble of the century. Here's a genuine question. Lee knew the math. He knew the South had fewer men. Was his decision to keep attacking a form of strategic courage, or the most expensive ego in American military history? 2 options, courage or ego. Drop it below. July 1st, 1863. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. 7:30 a.m. It begins because of shoes. Not a metaphor. A Confederate brigade from Henry Heth's division moves toward Gettysburg because someone reports a warehouse might have boots. Parts of the army are literally barefoot, men who've marched hundreds of miles on roads that destroyed leather faster than the supply chain could replace it. Heth asks his corps commander, A.P. Hill, if there's any objection. Hill says he knows of none. Neither man tells Lee. Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford has already spotted the movement. Buford does something that will determine the entire battle. He reads the ground. He looks south from the town, and he sees it. Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge running 2 miles south, 2 rocky hills anchoring the far end. He understands, with the professional reflex of a man trained to think in terrain, that whoever holds that high ground first wins this fight. He sends one message: come fast. Major General John Reynolds, commanding the Union First Corps, rides ahead of his infantry. He arrives at 10 a.m. He surveys the ground. He makes the decision immediately. This is where we hold. At 10:15 a.m., a Confederate sharpshooter shoots John Reynolds off his horse. The bullet enters behind his right ear. He's dead before he lands. One of the finest corps commanders in the Union Army, a man who'd been offered command of the entire Army of the Potomac 6 weeks earlier and turned it down, is gone in a single moment, and the battle has barely started. The Union forces fall back through town, but they fall back to exactly where Buford said they needed to be. Cemetery Ridge, the high ground. Union engineers spend the night turning it into a fortress. Lee arrives in the early afternoon. He sees the retreating Union troops. He sees where they're going. He sends Richard Ewell an order: take that high ground, if practicable. If practicable. Ewell decides it isn't. He doesn't attack. Historians still disagree on whether Ewell was right. Some argue his troop positions made an attack genuinely impossible before dark. Others argue Lee gave a suggestion when the moment demanded an order. What's not disputed, by morning of July the 2nd, the Union Army had spent the night fortifying ground that would cost Confederate forces catastrophically to assault. Nobody knew what was waiting at dawn. The argument Lee refused to hear James Longstreet is the best corps commander in Lee's army. Lee calls him his old war horse. He's slower than Jackson, less mythologized, not beloved the way Jackson was by the Southern press, but he understands something about modern warfare that Lee, at his core, refuses to accept. On the morning of July 2nd, Longstreet makes his case. Don't attack, he tells Lee. Move south, swing around the Union left. Get between Meade's army and Washington and force him to come to us on ground we choose. Let them attack. Make them pay for the advance the way we paid at Fredericksburg. Lee rejects it, and his reasons reveal the fault line running through his entire generalship. The what? Lee's army enters Pennsylvania with approximately 75,000 men. Meade's Army of the Potomac numbers roughly 93,000. Lee is outnumbered by nearly 25% before a single shot is fired. The why? Lee believed, and his dispatches to Jefferson Davis document this clearly, that the Confederacy couldn't survive a long war of attrition. The North had more of everything: men, iron, railroads, food, money. If the war became a grinding contest of resources, the South loses. Lee knew this, so he pursued dramatic battlefield victories designed to break Northern political will and potentially trigger European intervention. The logic sounds coherent. The flaw is mathematical. The how. Every offensive victory cost Lee men he couldn't replace. After Chancellorsville, arguably his greatest tactical masterpiece, the Army of Northern Virginia suffered over 13,000 casualties. Stonewall Jackson died from wounds inflicted by his own men in the dark. The army that crossed into Pennsylvania 2 months later was already thinner, already older, already less able to absorb the next round of losses. The cost. Gettysburg would cost Lee between 23,000 and 28,000 men in 3 days. The Union lost approximately 23,000 as well, but Meade's army could absorb those losses. Lee's could not. The echo. The decision to fight offensively at Gettysburg, to attack rather than maneuver, accelerated Confederate defeat by an estimated 12 to 18 months, according to military historians who've modeled the manpower trajectories. Every offensive action Lee took that summer is a direct, traceable line to Appomattox. Longstreet wanted to defend. Lee wanted to attack. History blamed Longstreet for decades after the war. Here's the poll. Who was right? Type L for Longstreet or LE for Lee, and tell us why in one sentence. July 2nd, 1863. Little Round Top, 4 p.m. Here is the forgotten hero, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, professor of rhetoric and modern languages at Bowdoin College, Maine. No formal military training. Less than a year in uniform. On July the 2nd, his regiment, the 20th Maine, fewer than 400 men, is placed at the extreme southern end of the Union line with orders that couldn't be simpler or more absolute. Hold this position at all costs. If the 20th Maine breaks, Hood's Confederate division flanks the entire Union Army from the south. The whole position unravels. The whole battle turns. Hood's men attack 3 times. The 20th Maine holds 3 times. By the end of the third assault, Chamberlain's regiment is down to fewer than 200 effectives. They're nearly out of ammunition. No relief is coming. Chamberlain orders a bayonet charge downhill. It works. It works because no commander in the history of warfare has ever expected a regiment nearly out of ammunition to fix bayonets and charge downhill, and the Confederates at the base of Little Round Top are no different. They break. The Union left holds. The entire Battle of Gettysburg may pivot on a decision made by a rhetoric professor from Maine. Chamberlain receives the Medal of Honor in 1893. He's mentioned in most Civil War histories. He is not mentioned nearly enough. Stay with this, because what happens next is the part they don't teach. The numbers Lee was running against the pattern starts before Gettysburg. It starts the moment Lee takes command. 7 days battles, June-July 1862. Lee drives McClellan from the peninsula and saves Richmond. Confederate casualties, approximately 20,000. Union casualties, roughly 16,000. Lee bled his army worse than his enemy, and won. Second Bull Run, August 1862. Confederate casualties around 9,000. Union heavier. Lee wins again. Antietam, September 1862. Confederate casualties approximately 10,300. Another battle Lee can't really afford. Fredericksburg, December 1862. Lee's defensive position is brilliant. He loses roughly 5,000 men to the Union's 12,600. This, right here, is what Longstreet will keep pointing to. When they defended, it worked. Chancellorsville, May 1863. Lee's masterpiece. His most creative battle. Confederate casualties. 13,000 men. 22% of the Army's strength. Jackson dies. By the time Lee crosses into Pennsylvania, his army has absorbed approximately 60,000 casualties across 2 years. The Confederate mobilization base is somewhere around 850,000 to 1 million total military-age men. Lee has been spending a measurable percentage of that finite resource on offensive engagements that produce battlefield victories and strategic hemorrhage simultaneously. The Union keeps coming back. Every time. Private Carlton McCarthy, Chancellorsville, May 3, 1863. Private Carlton McCarthy of the Richmond Howitzers writes about the night after Chancellorsville. He doesn't write about the victory. He doesn't write about Lee's brilliant flanking maneuver or the shock on Hooker's face. He writes about the men carrying Jackson out of the woods on a stretcher. Jackson had been shot by his own troops in the dark, 3 bullets, his left arm later amputated. McCarthy writes that the men who saw the stretcher pass didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They took their hats off. Jackson dies 8 days later. Lee writes to his son that he has lost his right arm. What he's actually lost is the one subordinate whose aggressive execution could translate a bold plan into an operational reality. Jackson didn't just follow orders, he amplified them. He moved faster than anyone expected. He appeared where he wasn't supposed to be. That quality, that irreplaceable quality, cannot be replaced by promotion. McCarthy writes in his diary that after Jackson died, something changed in the Army. Not discipline, not courage, something quieter than that. The feeling that they could win anything. Jackson's death may have cost the Confederacy more than any single battle. Here's the dilemma. If Jackson had lived, could the South have won at Gettysburg? Or was the math always going to win regardless of who was in command? Drop your honest read below. John Dooley, night of July 2nd, 1863. John Dooley writes in his diary the night of July 2nd. He's 20 years old now, 2 years older than the boy who watched flowers fall from Richmond windows. He's been at Second Bull Run. He's been at Fredericksburg. He's been at Chancellorsville. He has seen what a bursting shell does to the man standing next to you. He doesn't write about fear. Young men of his upbringing don't write that word, but it's in every sentence. He can hear Union artillery being repositioned on Cemetery Ridge. The sound of wheels on stone, of men shouting low commands in the darkness 3/4 of a mile away. Everyone in the Confederate lines knows what it means. They're building the wall higher. They're sighting the guns again. He writes that he prays. Tomorrow he'll get his answer about whether Lee's confidence is worth the faith the Army has placed in it. He won't like the answer. July 3rd, 1863. 1 p.m. Seminary Ridge. George Pickett's division is fresh. James Pettigrew's is battered from July 1st. Trimble's brigades are available. Together, approximately 12,500 men. Lee orders the assault. Longstreet, who must give the actual order for the charge to begin, writes later that he told Lee it would fail, that he believed completely it would fail. The exchange, as Longstreet described it, he said he didn't think any 15,000 men ever arranged for battle could take that position. Lee said it would succeed. The preliminary Confederate artillery bombardment, meant to suppress Union guns, overshoots. Most shells fall behind the Union infantry, not on them. The Union artillery holds its fire for most of the bombardment, conserving ammunition. The Confederate artillery chief sends a message before the charge. The horses are too depleted to move the guns forward if the infantry breaks through. There will be no artillery support during the advance. Lee orders the charge anyway. At 3:00 p.m., the infantry steps off. 12,500 men, every regiment with its colors flying. Fremantle watches from a tree near Lee's headquarters and writes that it's the most magnificent sight he's ever seen in his life. This wall of men in perfect order moving across the open ground. They walk into a furnace. Union artillery opens at 700 yards. Shell and canister tear through the formations. The training takes over. Close up around the gaps, keep moving. At 300 yards, Union infantry opens fire. John Dooley is hit in both thighs. He goes down in the open field, approximately 400 yards short of the Union line. He's alive. He'll be captured. He'll spend months in a Union prison hospital. But his part in this charge, in this war, ends here, in the Pennsylvania grass, listening to the battle move away from him up the ridge. Armistead's brigade reaches the wall. Brigadier General Lewis Armistead goes over with his hat on his sword. He's shot almost immediately. He dies 2 days later. The breakthrough lasts minutes. The men who get over the wall are surrounded and destroyed. 12,500 men walked out. 6,000 came back. Fremantle finds Lee riding among his returning troops. Lee is saying, "It's all my fault. This has been my fight, and upon my shoulders rests the blame." Fremantle records this as evidence of noble composure. History agrees with Fremantle. The 6,000 men who came back had a different interpretation. They just weren't the ones writing the history books. Lee said, "It's all my fault," after Pickett's charge, and history called that noble. But here's the question. Does saying "my fault" after 6,500 casualties mean anything if you kept command and kept ordering attacks? Is accountability without consequence just theater? Tell us below. The pattern completes. The Overland Campaign, 1864. Ulysses Grant takes command of all Union forces in March 1864. He makes one decision that Lee's previous opponents never sustained. He refuses to stop. Not because he's indifferent to casualties, the historical record doesn't support the butcher caricature, but because Grant understands the arithmetic that Lee has been racing against since 1862. The Union can replace its losses. The Confederacy cannot. Every engagement, regardless of tactical outcome, drains Confederate strength at a rate the South cannot sustain indefinitely. At the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, Lee's defensive positions are brilliant. Union casualties are severe. At Cold Harbor on June 3, 1864, a Union frontal assault cost approximately 7,000 casualties in under an hour. Grant absorbs it. He keeps moving. After Cold Harbor, instead of retreating the way every previous Union commander had retreated after a bloody engagement, Grant crosses the James River and besieges Petersburg. The Army of Northern Virginia is now in trenches. The army that Lee had spent 3 years building as an offensive instrument is now a garrison force. Not because Grant is smarter than Lee tactically, because Grant understood something Lee never fully accepted. In a war of this scale, between powers this unequal in resources, tactics are ultimately subordinate to arithmetic. The what? From May to June 1864, the Overland Campaign produces approximately 55,000 Union casualties and 33,000 Confederate. The Union replaces most of its losses within weeks. The Confederacy replaces almost none. The why? Lee's offensive battles of 1862 and 1863 had consumed the manpower reserves that might have sustained a longer defensive war. Whether an alternative Confederate strategy could have prolonged the conflict is something historians genuinely debate. What's not debated, the strategy Lee pursued accelerated Confederate exhaustion. The cost. The Army of Northern Virginia, that surrenders at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, numbers approximately 28,000 effectives. 4 years earlier, Lee commanded nearly 3 times that. The echo. The proportional casualty rate of the Army of Northern Virginia, the rate at which it was destroyed relative to available replacements, is the single most important statistic in evaluating Lee's generalship, and it condemns the myth. Stay for the final 10 minutes. What happened after the guns went silent is the part nobody talks about. If this hit different than what they taught you in school, hit like. It tells the algorithm this history deserves to be heard. Here's the hardest poll in this whole video. Grant lost more men than Lee in the Overland Campaign, and won. Lee lost fewer men than Grant, and lost. Does that make Grant the better general, or just the luckier one? G for Grant, L for Lee. Drop it. The American Civil War killed approximately 620,000 soldiers, Union and Confederate combined. Demographic historians working with census records have revised that figure upward. Some estimates reach 750,000. Others approach 850,000 when civilian deaths from disease, displacement, and starvation are included. 620,000 men, every single person living today in Baltimore, Maryland, gone in 4 years. The revised estimate of 750,000 approaches the current population of San Francisco. Of that total, Confederate armies suffered between 258,000 and 290,000 killed. The Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army, accounted for a disproportionate share, a direct reflection of its aggressive operational posture throughout the war. The casualty rate per major engagement runs between 15 and 20%. Some battles were worse. Gettysburg cost the Army approximately 37% of the force engaged. Chancellorsville cost 22%. Thomas Connolly and Archer Jones, in their 1973 work Politics of Command, argued that Lee's exclusive focus on Virginia represented a catastrophic strategic failure, that while Lee was winning brilliant battles in the East, the Confederacy was collapsing along the Mississippi and in Tennessee. Gary Gallagher has pushed back, arguing Lee's army sustained Confederate morale in ways that genuinely mattered. Both sides have serious historians making serious arguments. What isn't seriously debated? Lee's offensive strategy consumed his army faster than any alternative would have. Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. He's 58. He accepts the presidency of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. He spends his last 5 years careful about what he says in public, occasionally writing letters that reveal more than he intends. In September 1870, he suffers a stroke at a vestry meeting. He dies 14 days later. His rehabilitation into lost cause mythology begins almost immediately. Former Confederate officers need a figure of noble defeat to anchor a narrative that converts treason into honor and slavery's defense into a gentleman's cause. Lee becomes the saintly general, the man who wept for his soldiers, the tragic hero who fought for home, not bondage. The myth doesn't require dishonesty from any single person. It requires only that everyone ask, how did he fight? And never ask, was it worth it? Sergeant Drury Oddie, 11th Virginia, captured during Pickett's charge, spends over a year in Union prisons. He writes from Point Lookout Prison about the men who didn't come back from the field. He doesn't describe tactics, he describes names. He lists them. He seems to understand, from inside a prison camp, something that the generals writing their memoirs will never fully acknowledge. That every name on that list was a man who trusted the man giving the orders. Oddie survives. He returns to Virginia. He never writes about the war again. John Dooley recovers from his wounds in a Union hospital at Johnson's Island, Ohio. He returns to Richmond after the war. In 1866, he enters the Jesuit novitiate. He becomes a priest. He spends the rest of his life teaching at Georgetown, the same school where he was a student before the war began. He never publishes his diary in his lifetime. He dies in 1873, 30 years old. Tuberculosis, not a bullet. But the war hollowed men out in ways that didn't always announce themselves immediately. The boy who went to war for glory is nowhere in those final diary pages. He's been replaced somewhere around Gettysburg by a man who has learned the precise difference between what glory costs and what it's worth. Colonel Fremantle returns to England, publishes his diary in 1863 to considerable interest, and goes on to a distinguished military career. He reaches the rank of general, serves in colonial commands across the empire, and dies in 1901, a knight of the realm. His diary is the most useful primary source in this entire script, not because it praises Lee, but because it records what actually happened with the unvarnished precision of a professional soldier who had no stake in the myth that would come later. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in December 1865. The 14th Amendment establishes equal citizenship in 1868. The 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote regardless of race in 1870. Then Reconstruction ends in 1877 as part of the compromise resolving the disputed presidential election. Federal troops withdraw from the South, and the former Confederate states begin systematically dismantling every right those amendments had guaranteed, through black codes, vagrancy laws, convict leasing, Jim Crow legislation, and organized terror. The Lost Cause mythology, with Lee as its central figure, serves this project directly. If Confederate soldiers fought for honor and homeland rather than slavery, then the post-war South isn't a defeated treason. It's a noble culture overrun by force. Most Confederate monuments in public spaces weren't built in 1865. They weren't built in the immediate years of grief when the argument for them would at least be honest. The first wave came around 1900-1920 during the institutionalization of Jim Crow. The second wave came in the 1950s and 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. The timing is not coincidental. The monuments aren't memorials to the dead. They're political statements about who owns the present. The Lost Cause turned Lee's military failures into nobility. Here's the real question. Is it possible to honor Confederate soldiers who genuinely believed in their cause, while still being honest about what that cause was? There's no easy answer. Drop your honest thought below. Here is what Robert E. Lee actually was. A brilliant tactical commander with a catastrophic strategic blind spot who spent 4 years winning battles his side couldn't afford to win. He understood terrain. He understood the psychology of his subordinates and how to weaponize their aggression. He understood the narrow window, shrinking every month, in which Confederate offensive action could produce political shock in the North. He fought with creativity and audacity, and he earned the respect of every professional soldier who faced him. And he bled his army to death. The strategic logic was always flawed. The South couldn't win a long war of attrition. Lee knew this, so he attacked. But attacking cost him more men per engagement than defense would have, which accelerated exactly the attrition he was trying to avoid. Every time he went offensive, he was running the same gamble, that the political shock of a Confederate victory would break Northern will before Confederate losses broke Confederate strength. It never worked. Northern will did not break after Second Bull Run, didn't break after Fredericksburg, didn't break after Chancellorsville. After every Confederate victory, new Union regiments formed, new generals took the field, and the North kept coming. The strategy required something Lee couldn't provide, a Union that quit. The Union had no intention of quitting. This is why the myth matters beyond the history. When we build myths around commanders, when we decide that a general's personal nobility or tactical brilliance justifies the costs he imposed, We stop asking the harder question. Not, was he brave? Was he right? And was it worth it? Last question, and this one is personal. If you had been a Confederate soldier at Gettysburg and you survived Pickett's charge, would you have kept fighting for Lee? Or would surviving that charge have broken something? Drop it below. No wrong answer. Lee ordered Pickett's charge knowing the ground, knowing the artillery had failed, knowing what his own artillery chief had told him about the horses, knowing what Longstreet had told him about the odds. He ordered it anyway. And 12,500 men walked across that field. 12,500 men walked into an open field on July 3rd, 1863. The general who sent them called himself responsible. History called him great. The men who walked into that field had a different word. They just didn't live to write it down.